In February 1959, a group of 9 experienced hikers ventured into the icy wilderness of the Ural Mountains in Russia, aiming to reach a remote area known as Otorten. They were young, skilled, and prepared for the harsh elements. Yet, what should have been an arduous but routine trek turned into one of the most chilling mysteries in modern history. Weeks after the group failed to return, search parties found their abandoned campsite. The tent was torn open from the inside, their belongings left behind as though they had fled in terror. The hikers' bodies were discovered scattered across the frozen terrain, some partially clothed, others with gruesome injuries, fractured skulls, broken ribs, and one missing her tongue. Radiation traces were found on their clothes, and nearby, reports of strange lights in the sky fueled theories ranging from secret military experiments to encounters with something not of this world. This is not just the story of the DYATLOV Pass incident as the public knows it. Recently declassified documents suggest that the tragedy was part of a far darker narrative, one tied to classified Soviet military operations, unspeakable entities, and the kind of horrors that are buried by history to protect the living. The winter winds howled as Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov scanned the briefing room, his steely gaze falling on the 5 men and 1 woman seated before him. They were Spetsnaz operatives, hand-picked for this mission due to their survival expertise and combat skills. A map of the Ural Mountains was spread across the table, marked with red circles and cryptic notes. "This is not a rescue mission," Yuri began, his voice cold and measured. 2 weeks ago, a civilian hiking group disappeared in this region. The official report will say they were caught in a storm. What you need to know is that their deaths were not natural. One of the operatives, Sergeant Ivan Volkov, frowned. "What do you mean, not natural?" "Wolves. Wolves don't leave radiation behind," Yuri replied, tapping the map. "Their bodies were found with injuries that no animal or weapon can explain. The last thing we need is panic, so your objective is simple. Find the source of the anomaly, neutralize it if necessary, and ensure no trace remains." The room fell silent as the operatives absorbed the gravity of the situation. Corporal Nadia Petrovna, the team's medic, broke the tension. "And what if this anomaly is beyond our understanding?" Yuri's eyes darkened. "Then you pray you return alive." The briefing ended with a solemn air, the team dispersing to prepare their gear. As they boarded the military transport truck hours later, the sense of foreboding was palpable. The vehicle rumbled through the snow-covered roads, the icy expanse of the Ural Mountains looming in the distance. Nadia sat beside Ivan, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "You believe in the stories, the lights, the Yeti?" Ivan smirked. "I believe in what I can see and shoot. Whatever's out there, it'll bleed like anything else." But as the truck approached the pass, a strange feeling settled over the group, a quiet, oppressive presence that seemed to seep into their very bones. The radio crackled with static, the signal fading despite the clear sky. "Just interference," the driver muttered, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. But even he didn't sound convinced. They arrived at the site by dusk. The remains of the hikers' campsite lay before them, a tattered tent half buried in the snow, its fabric shredded from within. Yuri signaled for silence as the team approached, their rifles at the ready. Inside the tent were scattered belongings, boots, food, journals. But what drew their attention was the claw marks, not just on the fabric, but deep in the frozen ground beneath. They weren't human, and they weren't animal. Yuri knelt, his breath visible in the cold air. "This isn't natural." Behind him, a distant guttural howl echoed through the mountains, sending a chill down their spines. It didn't sound like a wolf. It didn't sound like anything they had ever heard before. Night had fallen over the DYATLOV Pass, blanketing the area in an almost impenetrable darkness. The moon's pale light barely illuminated the snow-covered ground, and the biting wind cut through even the thickest military gear. The Spetsnaz team had set up a temporary command post near the hikers' abandoned campsite. The tattered tent and its gruesome claw marks remained untouched, roped off as a silent warning of the unknown. Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov stood near a flickering portable heater, examining a torn journal recovered from the hikers' belongings. The entries began innocuously enough, descriptions of the trek, jokes, and weather reports, but the final pages were erratic, almost frantic. February 1st, strange lights in the sky. Thought it was a flare, but no sound. The others say it's nothing, but I feel watched. The last scrawled line read, "It's in the wind. It knows we're here." "What do you make of this, Lieutenant?" Nadia asked as she crouched beside him, her rifle slung over her shoulder. She had been monitoring the wounded morale of the team, which was already fraying at the edges. Yuri shook his head. "Nothing good." The team had split into pairs to secure the perimeter. Sergeant Ivan Volkov and Private Dmitry Orlov were stationed to the north, scanning the endless expanse of snow with night vision goggles. They were hardened soldiers, unshaken by years of combat, but even they couldn't deny the unsettling stillness of the pass. "Something's not right," Dmitry muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Stay sharp," Ivan replied, his tone firm, but his hands were tight around his weapon, his knuckles pale. Both men could feel it, an unnatural quiet, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. And then they saw it. A light flared in the distance, glowing an eerie, unnatural blue. It hovered for a moment, flickering like a dying ember, before darting sideways at an impossible speed. Dmitry swore under his breath. "Signal the lieutenant," Ivan ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his veins. Before Dmitry could respond, the light split into 2, then 4, forming a strange symmetrical pattern in the sky. They weren't flares. They weren't aircraft. The shapes pulsed rhythmically, casting faint shadows over the snow. And then the shadows began to move. Back at the command post, Nadia was securing a small medical kit when the team's radio crackled to life, Dmitry's voice urgent and panicked. "Lieutenant, we've got movement." The transmission cut out with a sharp burst of static, followed by an eerie silence. Yuri grabbed the radio, his voice firm. "Volkov, report. What do you see?" No response. Yuri signaled the rest of the team. "We're moving north. Weapons hot." The 5 remaining operatives advanced cautiously, their rifles at the ready. The wind howled around them, carrying faint, unearthly sounds, like whispers just out of reach. Nadia glanced over her shoulder, her stomach knotting. For the first time, she regretted volunteering for the mission. They reached Volkov and Dmitry's post within minutes, but the scene that greeted them made Nadia's breath catch in her throat. Volkov's rifle lay abandoned in the snow, its barrel bent as though crushed by an immense force. Beside it, a patch of crimson stained the ground, vivid against the white snow. But there were no bodies. "What the hell happened here?" Corporal Andrei muttered, his voice shaking as he scanned the area. "Eyes up!" Yuri barked. "We're not alone!" A faint hum began to build, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. It wasn't coming from any direction. It was all around them, seeping into their bones. The blue lights reappeared, closer this time, their pulsing rhythm matching the hum. And then came the sound, a guttural, inhuman howl that echoed across the pass. It was deep, resonant, and filled with malice, like the cry of something ancient and hungry. "Fall back," Yuri ordered, his voice cutting through the rising panic. The team moved as one, retreating toward the campsite, but the hum only grew louder. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, humanoid shapes that seemed to move with the wind. As they reached the campsite, Nadia turned to cover their retreat, her rifle trained on the darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing but swirling snow, and then it stepped into view, a massive, hunched figure with glowing, predatory eyes. Its form was barely solid, shifting like smoke in the wind, but its presence was undeniable. It let out another howl, and the shadows surged forward. "Inside!" Yuri shouted, and the team scrambled into the ruins of the hiker's tent, barricading themselves with whatever they could find. The hum was deafening now, shaking the very ground beneath them. Nadia clutched her rifle, her breath ragged, as the shadows circled the tent like wolves around prey. "Whatever this is," Yuri growled, "it knows we're here, and it's not going to let us leave." The makeshift barricade did little to muffle the sound of the guttural howls and the unnatural hum that seemed to vibrate through the air, the ground, and even the very bones of the operatives huddled inside the ruined tent. Their breath formed quick puffs of vapor as they crouched, weapons ready, eyes darting between the fabric walls as shadows flickered outside. Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov clenched his teeth, his gloved hand tightening around his rifle. The team had faced countless threats before, but this was something else. The enemy was invisible and omnipresent, an entity that moved like smoke and struck like a predator. "Check the count," Yuri barked, his voice sharp and urgent. He refused to let fear control him. "Who's here?" "Me," Nadia said, her voice trembling but steady. She was positioned at the rear of the tent, her rifle trained on the entrance. Beside her, Corporal Andrei grunted his acknowledgement, though his face was pale and drawn. "Private Sergei," came another voice, faint and breathless. He crouched by the remnants of the hiker's belongings, clutching a grenade like a lifeline. "That's 4, Yuri said, his stomach sinking. "Where's Volkov and Dmitri?" The silence that followed was deafening. Nadia's gaze flicked to the blood-stained snow visible through a tear in the tent wall. They all knew the truth, but no one dared say it aloud. "We can't just leave them out there," Andrei finally muttered, breaking the silence. "They're gone," Yuri said coldly, "and we're next if we don't move." But even as he spoke, the hum outside intensified, a low, resonant drone that seemed to pierce their skulls. The shadows, humanoid but twisted and shifting, grew more defined as they circled the tent. Then, without warning, the lights reappeared. Brilliant blue orbs hovering just beyond the perimeter. They pulsed in unison, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. "Movement!" Nadia shouted, her finger hovering over the trigger. The tent wall near Andrei erupted inward, the fabric shredding as though sliced by invisible claws. Andrei stumbled backward, firing wildly into the darkness, the muzzle flash illuminating the chaos. The shadows surged forward, amorphous and writhing, their shapes distorting as though the light itself wounded them. "Fall back," Yuri ordered, pulling Nadia to her feet as she fired a burst into the advancing darkness. The rounds passed through the shadows harmlessly, the entities recoiling only slightly before pressing closer. The team scrambled out of the tent, their boots crunching against the frozen snow. Yuri signaled for a retreat toward the tree line, where the dense forest might provide some cover. But as they ran, Sergei stumbled, his scream piercing the night as one of the shadows wrapped around him like a living fog. The others turned just in time to see his face contort in agony before he was dragged into the darkness, his cries abruptly silenced. "Keep moving!" Yuri shouted, swallowing the rising panic in his throat. They couldn't stop. Not now, not here. The 3 remaining operatives reached the edge of the forest, their breaths ragged, their nerves frayed. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches creaking in the icy wind. But even here, the lights followed, weaving between the trunks, their glow casting strange, unnatural patterns on the snow. "We can't outrun this," Andrei said, his voice breaking. "What the hell is it? What do they want?" Nadia pressed her back against a tree, her hands shaking as she reloaded her rifle. "They're not animals. They're not human. It's like..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "It doesn't matter," Yuri snapped. "We hold here, conserve ammo. If they come close, we hit them hard." The team formed a tight circle, their weapons trained outward. The lights stopped just beyond the range of their rifles, hovering like silent sentinels. The shadows, however, crept closer, their forms becoming more distinct. They weren't solid, but they weren't entirely incorporeal either, an impossible amalgamation of smoke, light, and something else, something alive. And then, from the darkness, a voice spoke. It wasn't a language they could understand, yet the meaning was clear. It was a low, guttural sound, layered with 100 whispers, resonating not in their ears, but in their minds. The words carried a sense of ancient, alien intelligence, a message that defied translation, yet filled them with dread. Nadia gasped, clutching her head. It's in my mind." Yuri gritted his teeth, resisting the urge to cover his ears. The voice grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by the hum that now felt like a physical force pressing against their chests. Andrei suddenly stood, his weapon falling to his side. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. "They're calling," he muttered, his voice flat. "We can't fight it." "No." Yuri grabbed him, shaking him hard. "Stay with me, soldier." But Andrei didn't respond. He turned and began walking toward the lights, his movements slow and deliberate, as though in a trance. Yuri shouted his name, but it was too late. The shadows enveloped him, and he vanished into the darkness without a sound. Nadia collapsed to her knees, her rifle slipping from her hands. "We're all going to die here." "No," Yuri said, his voice firm despite the terror clawing at his throat. "We're going to finish this." As the shadows closed in, he reached for the radio. The static was deafening, but he managed to get out one last message. "This is Lieutenant Mikhailov, DYATLOV Pass, Code Black. Send reinforcements. If we don't make it, tell them it wasn't human." The radio crackled once more before falling silent. The lights surged forward, with an intensity that seemed to ignite the snow around them, bathing the forest in an unnatural blue glow. The shadows twisted and writhed like living tendrils, coiling around the trees and snaking closer to the two remaining operatives. The hum had grown unbearable, a resonant force that rattled teeth and blurred vision. Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov grabbed Nadia's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Move!" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. She stumbled but obeyed, her rifle clutched tightly in her trembling hands. They ran deeper into the forest, the frozen ground crunching beneath their boots. The lights followed relentlessly, weaving between the trees with a grace that defied logic. Behind them, the shadows moved like predators, silent and calculating. Yuri knew they weren't just being chased, they were being hunted. "Yuri," Nadia gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own ragged breathing. They're playing with us." He didn't respond. He couldn't. His focus was on the path ahead, scanning for any kind of cover or defensible position. But the forest seemed endless, its dense trees stretching into infinity. Every direction looked the same, a maze of snow and darkness with no escape. The hum began to shift, its frequency rising and falling like a distorted melody. It wasn't just sound, it was communication. Yuri could feel it in his chest, in his head, a message that was neither spoken nor written, but understood on a primal level. They were being lured, guided, herded toward something. Up ahead, a clearing appeared, a circular patch of snow-covered ground surrounded by towering pines. In the center stood a monolithic structure, its surface black and glassy, as though carved from obsidian. Strange symbols, similar to those in the hiker's journal, pulsed faintly along its surface. their glow synchronized with the hum. What is that?" Nadia whispered, her voice trembling. Yuri didn't answer. He approached the structure cautiously, his rifle raised. The air around it was warmer, almost humid, a stark contrast to the freezing wind that bit at their faces moments ago. The hum was louder here, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. As they neared the monolith, Nadia froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Yuri, look." He followed her gaze to the base of the structure. Scattered around it were objects, ripped pieces of fabric, a bent rifle, and a blood-stained boot. Personal items from their team, and from the hikers. "They were brought here," she said, her voice breaking. "This is where it ends." Yuri tightened his grip on his rifle. "Not for us." But as he turned, the shadows struck. They came from all sides, moving faster than before, their forms twisting and elongating into grotesque shapes. Yuri fired wildly, the muzzle flashes lighting up the clearing in staccato bursts. The bullets passed through the shadows, but they recoiled slightly, as if in irritation. He aimed for the lights next, hoping to disrupt whatever force controlled them, but the orbs merely flickered and resumed their pursuit. Nadia screamed as one of the shadows lunged at her, its form wrapping around her torso like a living shroud. Yuri fired at it, and for a moment it dissipated, retreating into the darkness. He pulled her back, but she was pale, her breath shallow. "I can feel them," she whispered, clutching her chest. "Inside me, they're inside me." "Stay with me," Yuri said, shaking her. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Her pupils were gone, replaced by faint, glowing orbs. The monolith began to vibrate, its glow intensifying. The hum shifted into a higher frequency, almost a scream, as if the structure was awakening. The shadows moved faster now, their attacks more coordinated, driving Yuri and Nadia closer to the monolith. Yuri realized too late that this was the end game. The monolith wasn't just a structure, it was a gateway, and they were being offered to whatever lay on the other side. "Run!" he shouted, shoving Nadia toward the tree line. But she didn't move. She stood frozen, staring at the monolith as though entranced. "They're calling me," she murmured. "I can't fight it anymore." "Nadia, no." Yuri reached for her, but she stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The shadows parted to let her pass, and the light from the monolith grew blinding. She turned to look at Yuri one last time, a faint smile on her lips, before the light consumed her. The ground beneath Yuri's feet began to shake. The monolith emitted a deafening roar as the clearing filled with blinding light. The last thing Yuri saw before everything went dark was the shadows converging on him, their forms dissolving into a wave of blackness that swallowed him whole. Silence fell over the DYATLOV Pass, a silence so profound it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. The snow-covered clearing where the monolith had stood was now empty, save for a faint, circular imprint in the ground, as though something massive had once rested there. The surrounding trees were scorched, their blackened branches twisted unnaturally, as if recoiling from some unspeakable force. Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov awoke in the snow, his body trembling and his breath shallow. His vision blurred as he tried to orient himself. He was alone. His rifle lay discarded a few feet away, its barrel warped and useless. The frigid air burned his lungs as he struggled to his knees, his mind racing to piece together what had happened. "Nadia!" he rasped, his voice weak. He looked around the clearing, his heart sinking when he saw no trace of her, or of the rest of the team. The last thing he remembered was the monolith's blinding light, the shadows converging, and then nothing. The hum was gone, and with it, the lights and the shadows. The unnatural warmth that had radiated from the monolith was replaced by the biting cold of the mountain. But the oppressive feeling lingered, a sense that he was being watched. Yuri staggered to his feet, his boots crunching in the snow. The clearing felt wrong, as though it didn't belong to this world. He scanned the perimeter, his instincts screaming that he wasn't alone. Then he saw it, a faint trail of footprints leading away from the clearing, heading toward the forest. The prints weren't human. They were massive, clawed impressions, spaced too far apart for any known animal. Yuri's pulse quickened as he followed them, his every step accompanied by the creak of snow and the distant whisper of the wind. The trail led deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows darker. As he walked, fragments of his memory began to return. Flashes of light, the sound of Nadia's voice, and a feeling of being pulled toward something immense and incomprehensible. The further he went, the more he felt that he wasn't following the trail. It was leading him. The footprints ended abruptly at a steep incline, where a jagged crevice split the earth. Yuri peered into the darkness below, his breath catching when he saw faint glimmers of light. It was the same eerie blue glow he had seen before, pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. A sound echoed from the depths, a low, guttural growl that sent a chill down his spine. It was followed by whispers, faint and disjointed, as though carried on the wind. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were taunting him. Yuri took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But as he turned, he froze. Standing at the edge of the tree line was a figure. At first, he thought it was Nadia. The silhouette was unmistakable, the slender frame, the way she held herself. But as she stepped closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Her eyes glowed with the same blue light as the monolith, and her face was devoid of emotion. She moved unnaturally, her body jerking as though controlled by invisible strings. "Nadia," Yuri whispered, his voice trembling. He raised his hand as though to reach for her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she raised her arm, pointing back toward the crevice. Her mouth moved, but the voice that emerged wasn't hers. "Come," the voice said, layered with 100 others. It was deep and filled with an ancient authority. "See what lies beyond." Yuri took a step back, his mind racing. This wasn't Nadia. It wasn't human. Whatever it was, it had taken her, changed her. "I won't," he said, his voice firm despite the terror coursing through him. "I won't go." The figure tilted its head, as though amused. The glow in her eyes intensified, and the whispers around him grew louder, more insistent. The shadows began to stir again, slithering out from the trees, their forms coiling and shifting like smoke. "You cannot resist," the voice said. "None of you ever can." Yuri turned and ran, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. He didn't look back. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more frenzied, until they seemed to fill his very skull. The shadows darted between the trees, moving faster than his eyes could track. He stumbled but forced himself to keep going, the promise of survival, his only focus. When he finally broke through the tree line and into the open expanse of the pass, the whispers stopped. The shadows receded, melting back into the forest. He collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The sky above him was clear, the stars twinkling coldly in the vast expanse. But he knew the nightmare wasn't over. The forest, the monolith, the thing that had taken Nadia, they were still there, waiting. Yuri pulled out his radio, his hands shaking. Static crackled through the speaker, but he managed to get a faint signal. "This is Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov," he said, his voice hoarse. "DYATLOV Pass. Mission compromised. No survivors. Do not, I repeat, do not send reinforcements. It's not human." The radio crackled once more, before falling silent. Yuri dropped it in the snow, his gaze fixed on the forest. In the distance, The blue lights flickered faintly, a haunting reminder of what lay hidden in the mountains. He knew he couldn't escape the truth. The DYATLOV Pass wasn't just a place of death. It was a threshold, a gateway to something far older and far darker than humanity could comprehend. And it was still open. Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov sat motionless in the snow, his breath forming faint clouds in the frigid air. The forest behind him was deathly quiet, the eerie blue lights flickering intermittently in the distance like a predator watching its prey. The silence was worse than the howls, worse than the whispers. It was as though the mountain itself had exhaled and was now waiting for Yuri to make his final move. Yuri tightened his grip on the radio, even though it was dead. He knew reinforcements would never come, not after his transmission. The cold seeped into his body, numbing his fingers and toes, but he forced himself to focus. The mission had already failed, but survival was still an option. At least, that's what he told himself. He scanned the horizon. Somewhere to the south was the extraction point, a rendezvous that would never happen. Still, it was a direction, a goal to keep moving toward. He forced himself to stand, every muscle in his body protesting. His legs felt like lead, his boots weighed down by clumps of snow and ice. As he turned to take his first step, a sound froze him in place. It was faint at first, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Then it grew louder, a resonant, unearthly vibration that made the ground tremble beneath his feet. Yuri turned slowly, his heart pounding. The forest was alive again. The blue lights had grown brighter, forming a strange, swirling pattern in the sky above the tree line. The hum returned, deeper and more insistent, vibrating through his chest like a second heartbeat. From the forest emerged a figure. At first, Yuri thought it was Nadia again, but this time the figure was taller, its proportions wrong. Its limbs were elongated, its movements too fluid, almost serpentine. Its face, if it could be called that, was a distorted mask of light and shadow, constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide on a single form. The hum deepened, and with it came the whispers, layered, incomprehensible, and maddening. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at Yuri. "Join us," the voices said in unison, resonating not just in the air, but in his mind. "See what lies beyond." Yuri staggered backward, his hands shaking. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice echoing into the vast emptiness. The figure stepped closer, its form rippling like water. The shadows around it began to writhe, breaking free from the trees and coalescing into indistinct shapes. They were humanoid, yet grotesque, their limbs twisted and their faces featureless. They moved slowly, deliberately, encircling him like wolves closing in on their prey. Yuri's training kicked in. He raised his rifle, aiming at the figure in the center. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, as though amused. The shadows stopped moving, their forms swaying in the wind like reeds. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. Yuri fired. The shot rang out, the muzzle flash illuminating the clearing for a split second. The figure recoiled, but only slightly, its form rippling as though the bullet had passed through water. The shadows surged forward in response, their movements chaotic and frenzied. Yuri fired again and again, but it was futile. The shadows engulfed him, their cold, smoky forms pressing against his skin. He screamed as they invaded his senses, filling his mind with flashes of incomprehensible images, alien landscapes, towering monoliths, and endless voids where light could not reach. Somehow he broke free, stumbling backward out of the mass of shadows. He dropped his rifle, his vision blurred, and his ears ringing. The figure remained standing, unharmed, its glowing form pulsing with an almost rhythmic intensity. "Why?" Yuri gasped, his voice barely audible. "Why us?" The voices answered in perfect unison, their tone cold and final. You open the door. We are what lies beyond. The ground beneath Yuri began to tremble violently. Cracks spidered out from the snow, glowing with an otherworldly blue light. The shadows retreated, merging with the figure as the clearing was consumed by an immense, blinding radiance. Yuri fell to his knees, his body too weak to resist. For a moment, there was silence, and then the light vanished. When the light disappeared, so did the sound, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov found himself lying on his back, staring at the night sky. The stars above were bright and clear, as if the chaos of moments ago had never existed. The hum was gone, the whispers silenced, and the forest behind him lay dormant. But the air was heavy, saturated with the unmistakable weight of something left behind, something watching. Yuri's breath came in shallow gasps as he forced himself upright. His body felt like it had been torn apart and put back together wrong. The freezing cold clawed at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the overwhelming emptiness he felt. The clearing where the monolith once stood was now a featureless patch of snow, undisturbed save for his own tracks. It was as if the ground had swallowed every trace of the structure, the shadows, and the lights. He looked around, disoriented, his thoughts scattered. The tree line loomed ominously nearby, its skeletal branches black against the pale moonlight. He was alone, truly alone. Nadia was gone. Andrei was gone. His entire team, gone. For a moment, Yuri thought he might be dead, his spirit wandering the frozen wastes of the Ural Mountains. But the sharp pain in his chest and the burning in his frostbitten fingers reminded him he was still alive. Alive, but changed. Yuri stood on unsteady legs, his boots crunching in the snow. His hands trembled as he reached for his compass, but when he pulled it out, the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. The magnetic field here was broken, twisted beyond repair. He stuffed it back into his jacket and pulled out his map instead. But as he looked at it, the lines and markings seemed foreign, incomprehensible, as if they had been rewritten by an unseen hand. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This isn't the same world anymore. He began to move, forcing his legs to carry him toward the south, toward the direction of the extraction point, or at least where it should have been. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of his survival pressing down on him. Every sound, every crack of ice beneath his boots made him flinch. He no longer trusted the silence. It was too complete, too deliberate. As he trudged through the snow, something caught his eye. A faint glow appeared ahead, pulsing faintly against the horizon. His heart sank. It was the same blue light, distant, yet familiar, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. He stopped, debating whether to move toward it or turn back. But there was no back. There was only forward. The glow grew stronger as he approached, revealing a shallow crevice in the earth. Inside, the blue light flickered, emanating from what looked like a deep underground chasm. The walls of the crevice were etched with symbols, ancient, alien markings that pulsed faintly with the same rhythm as the hum that haunted him earlier. Kneeling by the edge of the crevice, Yuri peered inside. The depths seemed endless, the glow intensifying as it descended, and then he saw it, a figure standing far below, its form humanoid but distorted, its features shifting like liquid. It was staring up at him, its glowing eyes unblinking. Yuri. The voice echoed in his mind, layered with the whispers of 1,000 voices. It wasn't a call, it was a command. No, Yuri muttered, shaking his head. He backed away from the crevice, his heart racing. You won't take me. But even as he spoke, he felt the pull, the same force that had drawn Nadia and the others. It wasn't physical, but it was powerful, a compulsion that pressed against his will. His vision blurred, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath him. You opened the door, the voice said again, louder now. You cannot close it." Yuri fell to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers grew louder. Flashes of images flooded his mind. Towering monoliths, endless voids, and an ocean of shadowy figures moving in unison. He saw his team, Nadia, Andrei, Volkov, standing among the figures, their eyes glowing with the same eerie blue light. They weren't dead. They had become something else. "Join us," the voice demanded. "See what lies beyond." Yuri screamed, forcing himself to stand. He staggered away from the crevice, his vision swimming. The glow dimmed slightly as he put distance between himself and the chasm, but the voice lingered, faint and insistent, echoing in his mind like a broken record. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the forest, his lungs burning and his body trembling. The mountains loomed in the distance, silent and indifferent. The pass stretched before him, a barren expanse of snow and ice. But Yuri didn't care. He kept moving, his only goal now to put as much distance as possible between himself and the horrors he had witnessed. Days passed, or perhaps only hours. Time no longer felt real to Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov as he trudged through the endless expanse of snow and ice. The stars above were unchanging, frozen in their positions like cold, indifferent sentinels. His body screamed for rest, his muscles burned with every step, but he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. The faint blue glow in the distance was always there, flickering just beyond the horizon, like a predator stalking him through the frozen wasteland. Yuri knew the truth now. He didn't need words, explanations, or reports to understand it. The whispers, the lights, the shadows, they weren't visitors. They weren't invaders. They had always been here, hidden beneath the earth, waiting for someone to stumble too close, waiting for someone to open the door. And his team had done just that. He finally collapsed on a ridge overlooking the pass, his body too weak to continue. The frost gnawed at his skin, and his fingers had gone numb long ago, but he didn't care. The snow around him glittered faintly in the moonlight, as if mocking his struggle. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw shapes moving in the distance, figures like those that had taken Nadia, Andrei, and the others. They were watching him, always watching, but they didn't approach. Not yet. Yuri reached into his coat and pulled out a small, battered notebook. It wasn't his. It belonged to one of the hikers, their final journal filled with desperate, erratic entries. The last page had haunted him since he found it. "They're here, not men, not gods. Something older. We can't leave. It won't let us. We are the offering." He wanted to laugh, but his throat was too dry. Instead, he opened his own notebook, the one he had carried through countless missions. With trembling hands, he began to write, though he doubted anyone would ever find his words. "If you're reading this, leave now. Burn this. Tell no one. The pass is cursed, not by myths, but by the truth. Something lives here, beneath the snow, beneath the mountains. Something ancient, patient, and hungry. We came to investigate. We became their prey." He paused, his vision swimming as exhaustion overtook him. The blue light in the distance grew brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. He could feel its pull again, the insistent hum in his mind that had never truly left him. "It's not over," he wrote, his letters shaky and uneven. "They're still waiting, for us, for anyone. The pass is a door, and once you open it, you can't close it." Yuri closed the notebook and tucked it into his coat. His hands were too cold to hold his weapon anymore, so he let it fall into the snow. He stared out over the pass, the glow reflecting in his eyes, and felt an eerie calm settle over him. Then, the hum returned. It started as a faint vibration, barely perceptible, but it grew quickly, resonating through the ground and into his chest. The air grew warmer, the snow melting in patches around him. The shadows returned, slipping through the trees like smoke, their movements hypnotic and unnatural. They didn't rush him this time. They didn't need to. Yuri was too weak to resist. From the horizon, the blue light rose higher, brighter, until it consumed the sky. The shadows circled him, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo. Yuri closed his eyes, accepting what was to come. He thought of his team, of Nadia, of the countless others who had disappeared into the DYATLOV Pass over the years. They were all part of this now, part of something far greater and far more terrifying than he could comprehend. The last thing he heard was the voice, deep and resonant, echoing in his mind. "You will be the messenger." Months later, a Russian search and rescue team found the body of Lieutenant Yuri Mikhailov near the edge of the DYATLOV Pass. His face was frozen in an expression of calm, his hands clutching a battered notebook pressed against his chest. The investigators initially dismissed the discovery as another victim of the harsh mountain climate, but one detail defied explanation. Yuri's body showed no signs of frostbite, despite being exposed to the elements for weeks. The notebook was confiscated by the authorities and never made public. Unconfirmed reports suggest it contained frantic warnings and references to lights, shadows, and a doorway. Some pages were smeared with what looked like blood, and others had symbols etched into them, symbols no one could identify. After the incident, rumors of the pass being cursed grew louder. Locals avoided the area, and hikers who ventured too close often reported strange phenomena: malfunctioning equipment, disorientation, and most chilling of all, faint whispers carried on the wind. The Soviet government sealed off the region, declaring it a restricted military zone. Official reports dismissed the incident as a tragic accident, but among the search team, the story spread like wildfire. They spoke of strange lights in the sky the night Yuri's body was found, and of a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The DYATLOV Pass remains shrouded in mystery, its secrets buried beneath the snow and ice. But for those who dare to venture too close, the warnings are clear. The door is still open, and the shadows are always watching,